About 2 weeks before the launch of Lightfall, I released a video discussing the upcoming changes to Two-Tailed Fox, and how it may affect the weapon going forward. And in that video, I said something along the lines of, if the catalyst lets Two-Tailed Fox fire 3 rockets at one time, and the arc rocket is carrying Jolt, this weapon could be quite strong. And that is exactly what happened. So, I'm back to check in on Two-Tailed's damage post-update. Before we hop in though, I'm going to give you the number-heavy video warning. There is a lot to look at here, and if too many numbers getting thrown your way tends to hurt your head, pause the video, go suck down a few Excedrin ahead of time, and I'll see you back here in a minute. We'll start with a really brief overview of the weapon first for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it. This is a heavy exotic rocket launcher that was released about 4 years ago with the Forsaken expansion. And if you're someone who hasn't got your hands on it yet, it is a random world drop. The Twin Tail intrinsic trait allows it to fire 2 tracking rockets at once. One is solar, one is void. The exotic perk Play With Your Prey states that the void rocket suppresses targets, and the solar rocket deals damage over time. With Lightfall, that damage over time has been converted to Scorch rather than just a generic burn. In the newly added exotic catalyst, the third tail adds a jolt-applying arc rocket that fires out simultaneously with the second rocket in the volley. So let's get into the damage, and make sure you have your chest waders on, because we're going deep. I'm going to start out testing versus Carl to get the mechanics of what's going on here squared away. Then we'll hop over to the true baseline boss tier Hydra on Europa. And things have changed in that respect, so definitely stick around for that portion of the testing to get the full story. But when this volley of 3 rockets makes contact with Carl, you're gonna get a whole mess of damage numbers. The 2 values at 11,453 are the impact damage from the Void and Solar rockets. The 2 hits at 40,130 are the accompanying blast values. There's also a 135 tucked in there, presumably the impact from the arc rocket. And that 10,033 should be the blast for the arc rocket. So Bungie did tone down that arc rocket, presumably to keep the damage from getting too out of line. But just the initial combined damage of that cluster of rockets is 113,334. But then the Scorch starts rolling. You'll get 4 ticks at 1,031, and that will gradually diminish to 271. There were 14 Scorch ticks in total, dealing 10,225 points of damage. But just as the 8th Scorch tick rolls off, we cross the damage threshold needed to proc the Jolt, dealing another 17,400. So in total, we just dealt 140,959 points of damage. But there is actually a better way that this can play out. If the arc rocket hits ahead of the accompanying solar rocket, you'll get an immediate extra hit of Jolt. Now, I don't know if there's a real deterministic way to pull this off, but if fate will have it, this is going to tack on another 17,400 points to our total damage, taking us up to 158,359. Another interesting point worth highlighting, I tested things out when triple stacked with the Void Surge mods. 3 copies will improve weapon damage by 22%. But in the case of Two-Tailed Fox, it's not just the Void Rocket that sees the damage increase. Everything gets the boost. The Void Rocket, the Arc Rocket, the Solar Rocket, Scorch, Jolt, even the Ignition, which we haven't touched on yet, everything goes up 22%. The impact and blast from the 2 primary rockets go to 13,972 and 48,958 respectively. Arc Rocket hits for 165 and 12,240. The Scorch now starts rolling at 1,257, seeing 12,453 in total damage, while the Jolt jumps up to 21,229. In total, that's 171,947, or 193,176, if you're looking at a situation where the arc rocket does make first contact and you do get that extra hit of Jolt. Alright, one more thing to touch on here, and then we'll be moving on. Since the solar rocket was converted to Scorch, it also carries Scorch stacks, 60 at base. So with 2 back-to-back volleys landed in rapid succession, you can spark an ignition. One thing to make note of though, the suppression effect from the Void Rocket will persist, but both the Scorch and the Jolt will be snuffed out by the ignition. So let's take a look at the damage from a double volley. Just the impact and blast from 1 volley of rockets was 113,334, so with 2 volleys, 226,668. In the time it took me to reload between volleys, 5 Scorch ticks rolled at 5,073 damage. And as soon as the second volley hits, we secure the ignition at 42,717. As far as the Jolt goes here, you're gonna get at least 2 hits. One when the second volley of rockets makes contact, and another when the ignition touches off. But as we discussed before, there's always the possibility of a third if you do get lucky on that initial volley. When we total everything out, we're looking at least 309,258 points of damage. At most, 326,658 if you do see the extra Jolt hit. And since these totals are over double that of our single rocket totals, that means that it absolutely is worth playing for that ignition. And if you're curious about the ignition damage with the 3 Void Surge mods, it does jump to 52,115. If you want to see the damage breakdown with the 22% surge buff, it's on screen now. We're looking at 377,428 on the low end, and just shy of 400,000 if you do get that initial jolt hit. Pretty wild damage numbers. With that though, let's head over to Europa. For those of you who are unaware, Karl's damage received is reflective of that of a major tier enemy. This Hydra, it's a true baseline boss tier target sharing the same power level as Karl. And oftentimes, weapon damage is scaled back when you step up to a boss tier enemy. Now, pre-Lightfall, Two-Tailed Fox's damage actually increased versus bosses. It jumped up like 17%, the only exotic in the game that I'm aware of that this happened with. That's not the case anymore though. It does see a slight damage reduction when going from a major to a boss. And I mean slight, like a 1% decrease. I mean, just look at the blast damage from one of the primary rockets. We saw 40,130 versus Karl, and versus the Hydra, 39,687. A very negligible decrease. This is reflective in the jolt damage as well. It was 17,400 versus Karl, now it's 17,208. The Scorch, with it not being directly linked to the weapon, like Jolt, didn't fare quite as well. It lost roughly 36% of its damage. The tick started out at 1,031 versus Karl, versus the Hydra, 654. The ignition damage follows suit, but to a lesser degree. We are seeing 42,717 versus Karl, versus the Hydra, we're seeing 32,497. A net loss of about 24%. Now, for the boss damage totals, I'm just gonna spit the numbers at you. I showed you how everything broke down when we were testing versus Karl, and I don't see a point in running through all that again. For a base single volley of rockets, we're looking at 134,870, 152,078 if you do want to account for the extra hit of Jolt. Triple stacked with the surge buffs, that goes to 165,133, or 186,127 with the extra Jolt. Double volley at base, 293,227 with no extra Jolt, 310,435 with. The double volley with a triple stack surge buff moves up to 358,914 or 379,908. And those were mathematically figured numbers because this Hydra just doesn't have enough health to eat that kind of damage. So because some of the peripheral damage decreased in value versus a boss tier enemy, we lost about 4% of our total single rocket damage when moving from Karl to the Hydra, and roughly 5% if you're looking at the back-to-back volleys. Now, just having these damage numbers is all well and good, but they don't really mean much without some sort of basis of comparison. So I wanted to see how they stacked up against a legendary rocket launcher with a few things going for it. Like this blowout. It's nothing crazy, has lasting impression, and I will be using an applicable spec mod for about a 28% damage increase. And it does have impact casing, so we'll get a bit more damage with the impact value as well. Versus Karl, it does hit for a combined 148,800 points of damage. But versus the Hydra boss, we're looking at 113,197, about a 24% damage reduction. When comparing the two, versus Karl, it's kind of a toss-up. If Two-Tailed Fox gets that initial jolt hit, it comes out on top. If it doesn't, then this blowout bests it by about 8,000 points. Against the Hydra boss, even Two-Tailed Fox's lower end damage is better than blowouts by a margin of about 22,000 points of damage, just under 40k on the high end. So I mean, yeah, that is quite a damage discrepancy. One last thing I wanted to consider though, legendary rocket launchers can gain access to Wolfpack rounds if a teammate is using Galahorn. And for this test, I am going to be using the Grasp of Avarice Ogre for two reasons. One, at this point I'm kind of sick of staring at the screen and squinting at damage numbers. I'll just let the game read it for me. Two, it'll be nice to see some numbers in an activity where difficulty and damage scaling is increased. So I had to establish some new baselines first. One rocket from Two-Tailed Fox dealt 109,123 points of damage to the Ogre. For the 2-rocket test, I was having some trouble getting the Ogre to ignite. I'm not sure if the stacks are falling off quicker, which might be something to consider, but I was able to secure the ignition by auto-reloading the rocket launcher. In this case, total damage dealt was 254,704. Baseline for our blowout, and I do want to note the fact that this is not exactly a god roll rocket launcher. If you do have one with explosive light, you'll probably be doing about 5% more damage. But regardless, a single rocket dealt 92,793 points of damage. And before we even test it with Wolfpack rounds, perhaps we should see if just using Galahorn is a better option. And no surprise here, rocket for rocket, it's not. Not even close really. A single rocket from Gjallarhorn only netted about 70k in total damage output, which is well behind the other two rockets in question. Blowout, on the other hand, only needs to make up 16k damage to get on level footing with Two-Tailed. With the assistance of the Wolfpack rounds, it does that and more. I saw a single rocket deal 122,913 points of damage, exceeding the single rocket damage from Two-Tailed Fox by 13,790. Even if you take the average of the 2 volley damage from Two-Tailed Fox, this lasting impression blowout with Wolfpack rounds is right on its heels. If it did have explosive light, double rocket damage would probably be nearly identical to that of Two-Tailed. Another thing to think about is using a chill clip rocket launcher with Wolfpack rounds. Now, a lot of tests have shown that it's not exactly efficient to use multiple chill clip rocket launchers in a team DPS setting, but in this case, when just looking at a single rocket, because those Wolfpack rounds allow it to secure a freeze and then shatter damage on an enemy, total damage dealt ended up being 157,576. So even though Two-Tailed Fox is outputting some pretty stinking good damage numbers, it's probably not going to be a necessary pick in team DPS scenarios when damage output really matters. That being said though, for a solo player, as far as rockets go, this thing is top tier. The damage is very strong, and your total ammo reserves at base is 8. That's a shade better than most other rocket launchers. Plus, it has some really nice utility. It does have the capability to cause an ignition, which will stun unstoppable champions. And both the jolt and the suppression effect can disrupt overload champions. If you're running it on a solar subclass with easy access to the radiant buff, or if you have volatile rounds loaded up, then you have your anti-barrier capabilities as well. Then the suppression effect, which is not only nice for leaving targets affected by the Void Blast non-combative, if you happen to be running a Void subclass, you could put on Echo of Domineering and get a free reload. And the volatile rounds provided by Volatile Flow or Echo of Instability can eke you out a little bit more in terms of damage. And Jolt really is a nice addition to this weapon. It gives you a little more single target damage, and it is plenty strong enough to wipe out most red bar targets with just a single hit. Plus, you always have the option to proc Jolt with Two-Tailed, swap to another weapon, deal damage, and watch those Jolt ticks continually roll off. I think I could talk about Two-Tailed Fox all day long. I've always loved this rocket launcher, but I gotta stop myself at some point. It was always fun to use in the past, but with the changes that came with Lightfall and the addition of the Catalyst, this is now a damn good weapon. And while the focus of this video was mainly to measure the raw single target damage output, there's plenty of ways to build around Two-Tailed Fox to maximize its effectiveness. So to any of my Two-Tailed Fox users who hung into this point in the video, feel free to share some of your tips and tricks with your fellow Guardians down in the comment section. If you want a copy of any of the infographics that I had made for this video, hit me up on Discord or Twitter. Those social links can be found in the video description, and I'd be more than happy to send them your way. But with all that being said, thank you for taking the time out of your day to check out this weapon breakdown. You guys are awesome, and I will catch you on the next one.